Hi, I'm Heidi, your creativity coach, and I wanted to address the issue of what tools do we need to get started when we're knitting. You go to the store, you go online, and you search for knitting needles and supplies, and it can be very overwhelming because there are lots of options out there. And so I just wanted to go over the very basics and to show you that you don't need a lot. In reality, all you need is your yarn, a set of knitting needles, and a pair of scissors, and you're good to go. You can make an innumerable amount of things with those 3 tools. But there are a couple of other tools that can be useful as you progress in your knitting skills. So the first thing is we'll just go over our needles, and how you can know which kind of needles you need is by looking at your pattern. There's always going to be a size listed on your pattern, and also the yarn that you're using will have a needle size recommendation. If you look at the label, there are little boxes and it tells you the size of the yarn, the weight of the yarn, and the recommended needle sizes for both knitting and crochet hooks. I have a yarn weight guide that you can download in the free box PDF file area, and that will help you figure out what kind of yarn is best suited for each project. So back to our knitting needles, you have a couple of different kinds, and they are suitable for different types of projects. So we have the standard straight needle, and they come in different lengths as well. This is a pretty standard length right here, but some are longer and some are shorter. And this size right here is a size 10, and it tells me on the very end portion. Some knitting needles may not have that on there, and some it might be printed right on the needle. Now, if you are working with a budget, and you can really only afford to grab one set of needles, I recommend that you go for a pair of Susan Bates circular knitting needles in size 6 or 7. And you steer away from the straight needles for now, because we can knit straight back and forth on our circular needles, and we can also knit in a circle or in the round. So these will get both jobs done, whereas your set of straight knitting needles only allow you to go back and forth. And in order to go in the round, you need either a pair of circular needles or a pair of double pointed needles, and I'll show you those in just a minute. But I wanted to also compare. This is another set of circular needles, and it has a clear cable on it. These are not very flexible. I'm going to put it out there that I do not care for these types of needles. And I'm not going to mention the brand. There's actually a couple of brands that stocks this type of cable on it. But it's okay for straight back and forth knitting, and that's all I use this set for. In fact, I think I maybe picked these up in a thrift store. Always watch in the thrift store. You can always find needles there, and I like to grab them whenever I can. But anyway, so see how like this has a bad kink in it? It happens because they're not very flexible, and so if they get bent funny, it's stuck that way, and so that can get hung up on things. But also I don't like the join of the cable and the needle here. It's kind of hard for the yarn to slide down, and like I said, they're just not very flexible. As far as needles that you can just find in your regular everyday local yarn shop or big box store, will be the Susan Bates. I find that these are the best to work with. They have a nice thin blue cable. I like how they join up. They don't get kinks in them. These ones are brand new, so they're very spiraled right now. Something you can do when you first get nails like this, if you want, you can just warm them up over some steam, or I tend to just do it with my hands, and that will, it's already more stretched. So on to the next type of needle. Now we have double pointed needles. These ones have a tip at each end. And you need double pointed needles to knit in the round, but only if you don't wish to use circular needles and you don't want to use like magic loop type methods, which I teach in all of my circular knitting. The next most important tool I would say that you need in your toolbox, besides a pair of scissors and your yarn, of course, is a ruler that is especially for yarn projects. This is a Susan Bates brand one that I picked up many years ago, and it's all dented and bent, and I probably should get a new one because I imagine with the bends in it, it probably doesn't measure very accurately. But this little tool here does a lot of things for me. It has a ruler on it so that I can measure when a pattern calls for, you know, knit for 2 inches or something like that. And it has these holes through the center, which is a needle sizing guide. So this is really great for when you have a pair of needles that doesn't have the size printed on them. And most of the time, for example, these circulars, they don't have the size that's printed on them. I just bought these so I know that they are a size 7. They are color coded, but who can remember that? So we have this little tool, and you just stick your needle in the hole until it fits. So here's it is at the 6, and it stops right there. And then, but when I go up to the 7, it fits perfectly all the way through and can slide. So that means that this is a size 7 knitting needle. Alternately, we can go to a bigger one here that doesn't have a size, and I can go and go, oh, okay, that's the one that's too small. That's the one that fits. So this is a size 10 knitting needle. And it's a very useful tool. The other thing that it does is it has this L-shaped cutout. And what it is it has a measurement of 2 inches either direction. And what you can do with this is you stick your knitting swatch. Let's see if I have one. There we go. Here's one of my diamond knit washcloths. But you stick this on top of your knitted swatch. Let's see if I can go in. And it allows you to count how many stitches or how many rows per inch. And there is another video in the Know Your Stitches section that goes over how to find your gauge. And that's what that's called, when you need to count how many stitches and how many rows you made in an inch. That's called your gauge, and it's very important to find your gauge, especially when knitting garments, things that are meant to be worn, because you want it to come out properly and to fit nicely. And everybody's tension when they knit is differently. Everybody's tension when they knit is different. Some people are loose knitters, or crocheters for that matter, or they are tight. And generally, when you first start, you're one of those extremes. You're either really loose or really tight, and it's really great after some practice when you can narrow that down and get somewhere in the middle. The very last two tools that I want to show you are stitch markers and stitch holders. So stitch markers come in a lot of different ways in their base, usually just little ring type things, and they slide onto your needles. Get a couple open here. When you're knitting, and they come in different sizes so that when you're using really fat needles you can use big ones. And they come with little ones too for your little needles. They just slide on there, and what they do is they mark when you need to start doing maybe a special stitch, if you need to decrease or increase. They also can mark when you're knitting in the round, they can mark the beginning of your round. I also another type of stitch marker that I have is these little clip kinds, and I like these ones for marking a beginning of a round, for instance, because it needs to stay in a particular spot, and so it's kind of like a safety pin comes out, which brings me to, you can use a safety pin. You can also use a paper clip, and I have also made use like little keychain clips and put beads on them. So there's lots of things you can use for stitch markers. I have a friend who has used soda can tabs, where she took off all the soda can tabs and she used those. So you can get creative in your stitch markers, and there's lots of lovely cute ones out there for sale, like on Etsy and all kinds of things. So and then the other thing is your stitch holder. And this is for if you need to take some stitches off of your project because it's not either the pattern says that you need to do that because you need to hold them out of the way and you're not going to be knitting those stitches for a little bit. Or like me, if you're like me, I tend to use these really big ones because I need my knitting needles for another project. So you can slide off those stitches onto a stitch marker and hold them safe until you are ready to get that project going again. The alternative thing that you can do is grab a piece of scrap yarn and a needle and run it through the stitches and then tie the two ends together and then pull that off your needles, and that'll hold too. But so those are the basic tools that I recommend that you get when you are just getting started in knitting. So to recap, you need a pair of knitting needles, scissors, and yarn to get started. That's the basic things that you need. But if you want to invest a little bit more in it, then you can pick up some stitch markers and a gauge ruler and maybe even some stitch holders. Remember that if you're working with a budget, to go for the cabled circular needles, particularly the Susan Bates brand, so that you can knit both straight and in the round when you're ready to do that. Yes. Please make sure and contact me. Let me know if you have any questions or need any helps. Also, make sure you visit the supply page where you can click links to all of the things that I recommend that you use and get started with, and go to Amazon and you can just buy those right now and get them shipped to you. If you have Prime, you can get them in 2 days. Anyway, so I hope you have a successful adventure in knitting, and that I can support you as you take this journey.